a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. For those of you that are always asking me about my t-shirts, that's what it says. Not saying it was humans, but it was humans. Coffee, 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 coffee. I can't say enough about coffee, and a good cup of coffee is beyond description. I have found by sampling coffee from all over the country, well, actually, all over the world, the best coffee in the universe. No, I haven't been drinking coffee from all over the universe. How can I say the best coffee in the universe? Because in 2024 Coffee Championship of the Universe, Beelzebubba was the judge, and he declared Organic Man Coffee Trike Coffee as being the best in the universe. Yeah, Beelzebubba is one of Vic Hermanson's many voices, but still, he said it, so it must be true. You can easily find out for yourself by swinging by 4501 McPherson and trying a cup or 12. Julio buys and roasts organic coffee from all over the planet, and you can drink coffee that has never been soaked in any kind of nasty chemicals. I know not everyone is close enough to Laredo to drive to the shop, so if it's just too far and you haven't got a helicopter, go to organicmancoffeetrike.shop. Treat your taste buds as if they're your best buds. Yes, I'm still coughing a bit. My wife was invited to a wedding and I had to go along. I'm not into weddings, not into funerals either. Sit around with a bunch of people that we don't know and try to act nice. Plus, the music is almost always not to my taste. For some odd reason, my wife says it's rude to read a book while everybody else is cavorting about like school kids. I have met a few folks who, once they find out what I do, have had some interesting stories. It's near impossible to understand what they say while that music is blasting from every corner. What I hear might not be what they're saying. The first time I danced, I was 30. There was this young woman trying to teach me to speak Spanish so I could keep my job in the Border Patrol. We wound up on a date, and she drugged me out on the dance floor in front of everyone and attempted to get me to dance. It was so easy a caveman could have done it. Well, I'm not a caveman. She's my wife now and still trying to teach me to dance and speak Spanish. In between not enjoying the music and waiting to go home, I got to thinking about life, the universe, and, well, you should know. I got to thinking about some of the things that have happened over the years that were never in my list of things to do, like doing a podcast or writing books. I tried my hand at writing horror. I have read a lot of really good horror books, but I've read a lot of really bad ones as well. The secret to writing horror is lots of death, destruction, and small furry animals. If you don't recognize that reference, it's from a comic I used to collect long ago and far away. As I started to say, lots of death and destruction, blood in a 55-gallon drum. That's about it. Congratulations, you're now a horror writer. One day, after reading some of the fan mail, I decided maybe I should try a different direction, and I started writing humor. Humor is one of the hardest fictions to pursue. What I think is funny might not work for others. One of my horror books was called Ghouls, and it was based on World War I, which I was surprised to hear we have already had World War XI. Well, that's what she said. I read as much as I could about the conditions in the trenches and the men who fought and died because they believed they were doing the right thing. And the folks in the rear with the gear were getting enormously rich at the same time. So many men from the U.S. sailed to France to help fight the Germans. The French Foreign Legion had two entire battalions of nothing but American men. The officers all spoke French. The troops all spoke English. It is it is standard operating procedure in the Legion to teach everybody basic French. Well, there wasn't any time for that. So instead, what they did was they got all the NCOs who could speak French and English, and they put them in between the officers and the men. Most of these American troops believed the war would be over in a few weeks. Boy, were they wrong. The dying started in 1914 and it continued until 1918. Once the U.S. entered the European conflict, the American soldiers were given the option of transferring to the U.S. units. Many stayed in the Legion because they had kind of grown close to the men they were with. Men from every country on the planet, including a few Germans. Eugene Jacques Boulard, that's Jacques, I'm saying a French name in Spanish. Eugene Jacques Boulard was from Louisiana, and he had managed to become a pilot in the Legion. When he asked to transfer to the U.S. Air Corps, they said, nay, nay, no black men are allowed to fly airplanes. So he stayed in the French Air Corps and he racked up a very healthy record. I was fascinated by the parts of the war that most history lessons never mentioned. I tried my best, which really wasn't all that good, to put all the nastiness of trench warfare into a book with the exception of the smell. As if French, as if French, yeah, they do sound alike. As if trench warfare wasn't bad enough, I put in a creature, well, several creatures. Uh, they were there to mess with the men, make it into a real horror story. Ghouls were running around eating people. I had to do a lot of research into ghouls, and I hope the book isn't nearly as bad as I think it is. I haven't read it since I printed it back in 2015, and I doubt that I ever will. I am going to repeat some of the following information. I'm not trying to make the show any longer, but in some of these descriptions or legends, the similarities or the lack thereof are significant to the story. As you hear me saying the same thing 2 to 6 times, it's to keep the facts together. Depending on who you listen to, a ghoul is an evil spirit or a phantom that robs graves and feeds on dead bodies. So many men died in the trenches, and their bodies were never recovered. The entire battlefield became one huge graveyard. To add to the mess, a ghoul can take on the appearances of its last meal. The concept of the ghoul originated in pre-Islamic Arabian religion. It is thought ghouls have their roots in Mesopotamian religion and mythology because they have similar traits to a gula demon. The connection came from the nomads of Arabia interacting with the Mesopotamian civilization, trading goods as well as stories. The Gula demons were known to be a part of the underworld and were thought to carry their victims off to the land of the dead to devour them. Ghouls of Arabic mythology have very similar characteristics. The earliest stories of the ghouls emerged from I keep saying Arabic, Arabic legend. Boy, just because I'm feeling better doesn't mean that my brain is functioning correctly. The myth of the ghoul predates Islam, but because the ghoul is mentioned in the Quran, the creature is still a source of terror in Arabic culture today. Some hypothesize the widespread belief of jinn led to the implementing ghouls into Islamic religion. Others believe early practitioners of the Islamic religion used stories that were familiar to their culture in order to convert people to their new belief. There are several key factors that remain prominent in the early ghoul legends. One of the most important facts covered by early ghoul mythology is these creatures appear to be born of Iblis, the Islamic equivalent of Satan, which technically makes them jinn. Iblis was thought to be a predecessor of the jinn, or perhaps of a race of creatures called jinn, creations of Allah who lived in a world that was set apart from ours. Even though they were part of a different world, they were still capable of interacting with ours. It is said when Allah created man, Iblis became jealous that man was favored more than his kind, and so he refused to bow to man. He would have been killed for his crime, but his life was spared by Allah until Judgment Day. Iblis is using this time to take his vengeance on humanity. This is likely why the creation of ghouls is credited with Iblis, a creature who feeds on the flesh of humans and delights in their torture, is a likely form of revenge from a fallen jinn. The next time you watch old reruns of I Dream of Jeannie, keep that in mind. Ghouls of early Arabic lore were also known to dwell in deserted areas. People who traveled near cemeteries and abandoned buildings or through desert wastelands were warned to be especially vigilant against these creatures. They were said to be bipedal, with a hunched over form, but were known to crawl, walk, or even run on all fours like an animal. They were most fond of feeding on young kids, presumably because the ease with which they could be caught. But they would feed on any human they had a chance to cannibalize. Ghouls were also thought to have the ability to shapeshift. They could appear as beautiful women that preyed on lustful men by luring them to a secluded area, or as an animal in the desert, such as perhaps a hyena. They were known to stay in these forms until they had a chance to pounce on their victims and devour them. Ghouls were thought to be especially fond of preying on travelers found out by themselves or even in small groups. Some stories say they would light fires well off of the usual traveled paths so they could lure the travelers into a trap and then devour them. Another interesting feature of the ghouls of early legend is they were not particularly associated with eating only the dead. They were known to prefer fresh meat, and while they didn't turn down a corpse, all there was only if there was nothing else available. They certainly preferred a live victim. They were also known to enjoy drinking blood and stealing money. Early ghouls were known to carry disease on their skin, which could have been because of the types of places that they inhabited. I guess they weren't too fond of washing. In many early myths, there are descriptions of ghouls who are quite hairy. This is probably because they were known to have canine features. Having an appearance similar to a dog, it would be natural to conclude that the rest of the creature's appearance would have been animal like as well. One distinction was ghouls often had hooves instead of feet. Does this sound a whole lot like werewolves or dogmen? There are a lot of stories of dogman sightings where the creature was seen eating roadkill. Add to this the possibility of there being shapeshifters, and you could easily put the werewolf, dogman, and ghoul in the same boat. If you did, who would be the captain? I must include the creature de jour, the skinwalker. So many folks have put the name skinwalker into every encounter, it has become the go to name for just about everything. I guess they like the way the name sounds. I could find no reference to skinwalkers ever eating people. A few stories, but they were not based on any tribal beliefs. How about we stop calling everything a skinwalker and try some other names? The Wendigo could be a type of ghoul. The Wendigo is often said to be a malevolent spirit, sometimes depicted as a creature with human like characteristics who can possess humans. It is said to cause its victims to feeling of insatiable hunger, the desire to eat other humans, and the propensity to commit murder. In some representations, the Wendigo is described as a giant humanoid with a heart of ice, whose approach is signaled by a foul smell and a sudden unseasonable chill. They're also known as ice giants. It's close, yet there are several differences. Too many researchers try to squeeze every cryptid into a box that diminishes the number of creatures. Any flying humanoid is quickly dubbed the Mothman. Any hair covered humanoid is called the Bigfoot. Just because it looks similar doesn't mean that that's what it is. We don't really know. Perhaps they're all related, yet they look a little different. Slightly different depending on the area or the people encountering them. There are also accounts of ghouls who would transform into other animals. While it is possible for a ghoul to transform into any type of animal, it seems that the popular choice was the hyena, or as Cam and Kyle would say, a hyena. The ghoul would use the form of the hyena to lure a person into the desert, although I'm not too sure why anyone would follow a hyena, but when they were far enough from civilization, the rest of the pack would appear and pounce on the victim. They would then devour them. It is also important to note that in addition to having a canine like face, early ghouls were also thought to have humanoid bodies and hoof like feet. These were characteristics that were used to identify the presence of a ghoul, the hooves especially. It was said that when a ghoul was in the area, you would see hoof track marks in the dirt. Ghouls were known to prefer crawling on all fours, even though they were capable of walking on 2 feet. The English word ghoul is from the Arabic word ghoul that sounds the same but is spelled differently. The word first used in English literature in 1786 in William Beckford's Orientalist novel Vathek, which described the ghoul of Arabic folklore. Some legends say that ghouls will hang out in a pack of 6 or 7 creatures. Others say they are solitary beings that don't get along with others of their kind. In Arabic folklore, the ghoul is said to dwell in cemeteries and other uninhabited places. A male ghoul is called a ghoul, while a female is called a ghoulah. The scholar Dwight Reynolds identifies the Arabic ghoul as being a female creature, sometimes called a mother ghoul. In tales told to girls and young women, that's an actual book, kind of like an old time Goosebumps kind of thing. In these tales, the ghoul appears to men as a long lost female relative or an unassuming older woman. She uses this glamour to lure the hapless characters, who are usually husbands or fathers, into her home, where she can kill them and eat them. To glamour means to make something appear more attractive or fascinating than it actually is. The unaware male characters, female relatives, can often see through the illusion and they try to warn them of the danger. The men survive if they listen to the women. I've often said most of my worst ideas are because I don't listen to my wife. In the Syrian folk tale, the woodcutter's wealthy sister, which is also known as the woodcutter's wary wife, a poor but arrogant and spiteful woodcutter encounters a beautiful, wealthy princess who tells him that she is his long lost sister, even though he doesn't have any siblings. The woodcutter accepts this mysterious princess's invitation to bring his wife, who he isn't exactly treating very well, and his children to live in her palace. The wife discovers that this princess is in fact a female ghoul who is planning to eat the woodcutter and his family. After narrowly escaping the ghoul's attempts to eat them, the wife and her children flee the palace, but the husband doesn't listen and he stays behind and gets eaten. The ghoul is also said to lure unwary people into the desert wastes or abandoned places to slay them and then devour them. The creature preys on young children, drinks blood, steals money, and eats the dead. It also takes on the form of the person that it most recently ate. One of the narratives identifies a ghoul named Ghul-e-Bayaban, a particularly monstrous creature believed to be inhabiting the wilderness of Afghanistan and Iran. A hyena that attacked a woman in Mecca in 1667 was referred to as being a ghoul, possibly due to a perceived similarity of the creature of folklore. El-Damaski described a ghoul as a cave-dwelling animal who only leaves at night in order to avoid sunlight. They would eat both humans and animals. Anton Gouland translated A Thousand and One Nights into French, that the Western got the concept of the ghouls from. Galland depicted the ghoul as a mysterious creature that dwelt in cemeteries, feasting on corpses. The translation of the original A Thousand and One Nights was a bit tainted because Galland loose interpretations. He is thought to have created several of the characters that were not in the original text, and he also added a few stories. One of the characters that he created was Amina, a woman who enjoyed the company of ghouls that inhabited a nearby graveyard instead of staying at home with her husband. This version of ghouls introduced the idea that the creatures frequented graveyards specifically to feast on the dead, which in turn had a large impact on how Europeans grew to perceive the ghoul legend. The word ghoul entered the English language and was further identified as a grave robbing creature that feeds on dead bodies and children. In the West, ghouls have no specific shape, but they were described by Edgar Allan Poe as being neither man nor woman, brute nor human. In Pickman's Model, a short story by H.P. Lovecraft, ghouls are members of a subterranean race. Their diet of dead human flesh mutated them into bestial humanoids, able to carry on intelligent conversations with the living. The story has ghouls set underground with ghoul tunnels that connect ancient human ruins with the deep underworld. Lovecraft hinted that the ghouls emerged in subway tunnels to feed on train wreck victims. Any of y'all watch the TV show The Night Gallery? That was the follow up to Twilight Zone. In season 2, episode 11, uh, H.P. Lovecraft's Pickman's Model was turned into a TV show. It starred Bradford Dillman and Richard Upton. Oh, it was Bradford Dillman who played Richard Upton Pickman, and Louis Sortel, who was Mavis Goldsmith, a student of Pickman's, who is in love with him. Robert Roshka plays the ghoul. An art teacher tells his students to paint what they see. Mavis sees a painting of this hideous creature and she wants to know, did he actually see this thing? She pays Pickman a late afternoon visit only to encounter a ghoul. This is when they find out why Pickman always wears gloves. After seeing this episode, I tried to recreate the creature in art class. Tried is the key word here. Lovecraft's vision of the ghoul, shared by Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard, has heavily influenced the collective idea of the ghoul in American culture. Ghouls are described by Lovecraft as being dog faced and hideous creatures, but not necessarily malicious. Though their primary food source is human flesh, they don't actually seek out living humans. They are able to travel back and forth through the well of sleep. This is demonstrated by Lovecraft's The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, in which Richard Carter encounters Pickman in the dream world after his complete transformation into a mature ghoul. I read a book a while ago, I can't remember the name of it, where somebody has imported a shipload of ghouls into New York City. And these creatures cavort about town, killing and eating people. It's been a long time ago, and I can't find a copy of the thing simply because it was so long ago that I read it. If this sounds familiar to any of y'all, shipload of ghouls, lots of death and destruction, blood in 55-gallon drums. Pretty nasty story. I'd like to read it again. So if it sounds familiar, could you maybe give me the title in the comments? In the book The Time Machine, the Morlocks are very similar to ghouls. They live underground and they use the surface dwellers as their source of food. Ghouls are also considered to be changelings. The ghoul parent abducts a human infant and replaces it with one of their own. Any of y'all remember how the fairies will do this? Ghouls appear entirely human as children, but they begin to look like ghouls as they get older in life. The fate of the replaced human children is not entirely clear, but Pickman offers a clue in the form of a painting depicting a mature ghoul as they encourage human children to cannibalize a corpse. This version of the ghoul appears in stories by authors such as Neil Gaiman, Brian Lumley, and Guillermo del Toro. Some people use the word ghoul to refer to someone who likes scary stuff. Horror stories or movies with an excessive amount of bloodshed, like the blood sucking pharaohs of Pittsburgh. Or how about Dead Alive? Once more, depending on who you ask, sometimes ghouls will kill people in order to feed. It has been suggested that these ghouls can also access memories of the person that they devour by eating their brains, effectively allowing them to blend into society without being discovered. Their skin is said to be kind of rubbery looking and not quite human. Also, some think ghouls stay out of sunlight. Sunlight is supposed to be painful for them. Not like vampires, but just painful. Ancient stories of vampires, they were not supposed to have problems with light. The reason that the vampires stayed out of sunlight was because if you saw one coming, you could easily walk away. They moved around at night so they could sneak up on people. It's also dependent on which part of the world you believe in vampires are from. Ghouls tend to live in isolated places that are apart from the majority of society. They can frequently be found in desert wastelands, abandoned buildings, and cemeteries. The contrary to common beliefs, a ghoul does not necessarily prefer to reside in a cemetery. That's just where they go to look for food. They also prefer seclusion, and a lot of people don't hang out in cemeteries at night. Recent tales of ghouls suggest the creature have moved their operations largely underground. They are said to frequent basements and cellars in abandoned buildings and are even rumored to have an underground network of tunnels. They may also have connections to the subways and are thought to sometimes cause train wrecks so they can have an easy meal. Some said a ghoul could create new ghouls by using alcohol in some kind of an ancient ritual. Considering alcohol is forbidden in the Middle East, I wonder if this was just a plot twist or a reason you weren't supposed to drink. Some legends say that two ghouls can get together after a night of dancing and drinking and make little baby ghouls. Unfortunately, these same stories say that ghouls will eat their own offspring. There were some theories that arose in ghoul mythology that claimed that these creatures could mate with humans, often humans who had been mistakenly buried, or humans that they snatched off of the street somewhere. In this manner, ghouls were able to keep a stronger gene pool and not just constantly mating with the same small group. Some say the ghoul will kidnap humans and have their ways with them, and thus create new ghouls. Of course, there's the old get bitten by a ghoul and become a ghoul idea, just like in the werewolf legends. A ghoul's skin is said to be teeming with nasty things that will move from being to being upon contact. Some legends say ghouls are not descendants of old ghouls, but are humans who have become so wicked they are transformed into creatures that do all the things associated with ghouls, and thus they become these creatures. Wicked times and wicked deeds creating wicked beings. Think about some of those stories of the elites getting together and dining on human flesh. The most common method for using the most common method used to kill a ghoul is decapitation. Ancient ghoul legends said that ghouls could be killed using a sword, but it is imperative that the attacker must kill the beast with one blow. Several blows of a sword will simply make the ghoul angry. Because only one strike can be used to kill a ghoul, decapitation was the preferred method. This is also how you kill a vampire. That stake is just there to pin the undead to the ground so you can cut their head off. I really wish I'd stopped coughing, but apparently I'm not going to. More recent stories tell us there are several other ways a ghoul can be dealt with. One of these methods is fire. Using fire can be tricky because you have to get extreme temperature in a very short period of time. A flamethrower would be a great way to deal with a ghoul, but make sure that the tank is full before you do anything. You don't want to find yourself in Kurt Russell's shoes in the movie The Thing. His flamethrower always chose the exact wrong moment to run low. It is also thought that electrocution and exposure to concentrated acid can kill ghouls. This has to be done thoroughly, though. If a ghoul is not dead or a small portion of it remains, it can regenerate itself. Take the ghoul down to the old chemical plant at the edge of town and drop him in that giant vat of acid. Yeah, that's from a horror movie I watched. Not a, well, it was a spoof horror movie. Carl Kolchak was one of the best non heroes on TV ever. He dealt with all the well known as well as unknown creatures, everything from vampires to the Rakshasa. Rakshasa are an ancient race of supernatural beings that appear prominently in Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions. They are believed to have been created by Brahma, the Hindu god of creation, and were originally tasked with protecting the earth. According to legend, many Rakshasa became corrupted and evil, leading them to be associated with demonic tendencies. Some Rakshasa remained neutral or even good, but many are characterized as malevolent spirits who cause harm to both the gods and humans. The most famous Rakshasa in Hindu mythology is Ravana, a 10-headed demon king who plays the primary antagonist in the Ramayana. Though an evil figure in the epic, Ravana is also portrayed as a complex character, powerful, intelligent, and even noble in some aspects, showing the multifaceted nature of the Rakshasa. How can an evil monster also be noble and good? Consider Vlad Tepes. Most folks think of him as a horrible ruler who impaled his enemies. Vlad was tasked with keeping the Muslims out of Europe by the Pope. He did what at the time was considered normal, if a bit over the top. Vlad did not invent impaling, he just perfected it. Rakshasa are typically depicted as fierce, terrifying creatures with grotesque, distorted features. They often have sharp fangs, claw like nails, and glowing red eyes. Their bodies are usually large and muscular, and they are frequently portrayed with multiple arms or heads, adding to their monstrous appearance. In some depictions, Rakshasa have animalistic features, such as tiger or dog heads, which enhance their predatory nature. One of their most fearsome traits is their ability to shapeshift. Rakshasa can transform into any creature or person, using their powers to deceive humans and gods alike. They often take on the form of a trusted individual, such as a family member or somebody in the clergy, to manipulate their victims. This shape shifting ability, combined with their intelligence and their magical powers, makes them a dangerous adversary who is very difficult to defeat. Think about what that means. They can somehow get inside your mind and find a figure that you trust. This allows them to look and act like somebody they have never met. Rakshasa are also known for their sorcery and illusion casting abilities. They can create false realities, confuse their enemies with illusions, and summon dark magic to aid in a battle. Many Rakshasa possess the ability to fly, making them even more formidable in combat. In addition to their magical abilities, they are skilled warriors capable of wielding powerful weapons and using strategies to defeat their enemies. They simply love eating the dead and drinking their blood. They take on the appearance of others, not necessarily someone that they ate, but somebody not them. Sounds a whole lot like the ghouls. I'm not trying to squeeze these kinds of creatures into being one another. I am wondering why so many creatures of legends and stories that can do and look similar to each other. Why do you find Bigfoot in every legend of the Indians, even tribes that never met each other? In Raleigh, North Carolina, three ghost investigators were poking around the Oakwood Cemetery. They wandered over to the older part where few folks would go because it was in pretty bad shape, and they started looking at the old graves. Got to thinking, that would make an interesting TV show. Flip My Grave. Contestants compete to see who can rehabilitate an old burial plot. Maybe not that interesting. More interesting than 90% of what's on TV right now. Where was I? What do you think Joanne Gaines would do with an old cemetery plot? Three ghost hunters were looking for activity in a cemetery. They found an old crypt. The door was mostly closed by the dirt that had shifted into the opening. I tried to look up the definition of a crypt, and I was overwhelmed with different suggestions on what a crypt actually is. The basic two explanations are a room to house the dead, either in a church or in a cemetery. There are maybe a dozen or two more other descriptions of what a crypt was, but we'll just go with those two. If the crypt is in a church, it's a church crypt, and if it's not in a church, it's called a field crypt or a garden crypt. You can have a garden crypt in a cemetery or a church crypt in a church, and that's it. The ghost hunters were looking at an old garden crypt. As they were filming the entrance, a white, emaciated creature comes rushing from the opening right at the camera. And the camera goes to the ground, and that's the end of the footage. The story goes that the ghost hunters have vanished. Nobody knows where they went or what has become of them. They say if you look closely at the crypt, you can see their faces burned into the stone by the entrance. Now, I could only find one reference to this story, but it did sound a bit cool, so I included it here. It could have been creepy pasta. I don't know. From July 1st to the 3rd, 1863, soldiers from the North and the South killed each other in a near industrial numbers at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. 40,000 American casualties from the battle. 7,800 died that they know of. Armies don't have time or the manpower to stay after a major battle and bury the dead, so the bodies just laid where they fell. The severed arms and legs that were removed at the hospital just laid in a pile. Nobody did anything with them. Dead horses were everywhere. If you've never been around a dead person after, say, a week or two, it has a distinct aroma, something that gets into your sinuses and lingers. It gets into your clothes. Days later, if you pull the clothes out of the laundry, it's like, whoa, smells like a dead guy. If you do encounter a dead person that's been out there a while, you want to wash your uniform right away. On a hot day, like in July, it gets ripe fast. Creatures show up to take care of what most humans would run from. Vultures come from all around to feast on the aftermath. To them, this is a great thing. Uh, to others, it's a scene from a horror movie that hasn't been invented yet, not for another 60 years. People living 40 miles away in York did not want to go outside because of the smell. As each day went by, it only got worse. Flies swarmed the place, eating and making baby flies. You do know what a baby fly is, right? Baby fly, doot, 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 baby fly. Okay, it's a maggot for those of you on podcast, not seeing the video. Nobody in Washington or Richmond stood up and said, "We need to pay somebody to clean up that mess we just made." Civilians who had fathers and husbands, brothers and sons rotting in the sun began to collect money to pay for proper burials of their relatives. It was getting harder each day to know who was who, but that didn't stop the entrepreneurs from charging to go find a particular body and return it to their hometown. I am willing to bet that most of the fallen soldiers are not who they think they are. Another kind of entrepreneur showed up at the smelly scene. A man named Godfor showed up not to help bury, but to look for valuables and to take them. You have to be a certain kind of a lowlife and have a strong stomach in order to rifle through dead people's clothing looking for anything that you can steal and then sell. Coins, religious medallions, rings, personal items carried into battle by soldiers on both sides. Things that should have been returned to the families wound up in this guy's swag bag. This was not his first battlefield. He was following the army, waiting for any battles and the soldiers that would march on after killing each other. Once the killing and dying had stopped, Godfer would wander the field looking for anything that he could make a buck on. Any soldier found still amongst the living, well, was not going to survive a visit from Godfer. He wasn't there to save anybody's life. He was there to make a living. As bodies sit under the sun, they tend to swell. In order to remove rings, the person doing the removal will use a device to simply snip the fingers off. To us, this is desecration. To the guy doing it, it's just part of the job. It did not take too long for the authorities to be contacted, and the man was arrested. He was hauled off to jail, but somebody did manage to get a photograph of him. He became known as the Ghoul of Gettysburg. You can look it up. Just type in Ghoul of Gettysburg and you'll see a picture of Godfer. The weird thing about this photo is it was taken in a studio. Godfer was dressed in his body robbing outfit, but the background is a nice little wall and a clean background. He wasn't the only person robbing the dead, but he did get caught and he became famous because his photo was released to the public. It was printed and sold as a souvenir of the battlefield. Now, Godfer never ate the dead, as far as we know. He didn't dig up any of the bodies, seeing as most of them were still laying where they fell. The name Ghoul was given to him just the same. I imagine perhaps his name was not actually Godfor, but they might have called him a God-forsaken person, and the name was simply shortened. I could not find any report as to what became of the man, locked away in some jail cell somewhere, or perhaps an insane asylum. As for all those bodies smelling up the area, people were paid to dig massive holes and dump the bodies in. A lot of the men doing this work were freed slaves, most of who never got paid. There's an odd outcome from the battle. At the end of the shooting, those vultures that had come from all around, seeing as the smell could be detected 40 miles away by mere mortals, and vultures have a much better keen sense of smell, well, they followed the dinner bell from everywhere, and it must have been quite a sight. Over the years, Vultures are seen flocking to the battlefield each year in the first weeks of July. Thousands of birds land in the field as if looking for dinner. It has been 163 years since the huge dinner party that they all must speak of even today. A vulture lives about 30 years, so this story was somehow passed on from vulture to vulture. The boys in the white lab coats say that vultures are just there because it's an open area where they can land. I think they have some kind of a shared memory, and they're now looking longingly at what had been a enormous dinner party way, 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 way back. During the Great War, the war to end all wars, also known as World War I, since it didn't end anything, the battle lines moved back and forth. It all started when the Germans invaded France and the French tried to chase them out. Instead of running, the Germans dug in. The French dug in as well. As time moved on and neither side would quit, the trenches became more elaborate and longer. The Germans decided they were there for the long haul, and they began building small towns into the sides of their trenches. The French began to improve their side as well. Now, the area between the two lines became known as no man's land because nobody controlled it. In the movie The Trench, starring Daniel Craig, they show no man's land as being a nice field. No destruction whatsoever. I had to look this up because no man's land was a pockmarked, war torn mess. The director was trying to show the vast differences between what had been back in 1914 and what had happened by 1916. Each morning or evening, soldiers on both sides would stand to, ready to either defend the trenches or attack the other side. Most had no idea if they would stand there for an hour or be ordered over the top. As both sides tried to push the other out, trenches changed hands, sometimes on a daily basis. Shell holes were everywhere. Soldiers would reinforce the sides created defensive positions. On occasion, entire underground complexes were built by one side only to be occupied by the other for a while and then reconquered. When orders came down to go over the top, entire companies of men would run out across no man's land, trying to make it to the other side without being shot. The dead knew only that they were dead, but the wounded had other problems. At first, after each charge, an unofficial ceasefire would be declared, and both sides would go out to collect their dead and wounded. Well, it didn't take long for this treaty to get pushed aside, and anyone seen moving in no man's land was a target for both sides. Shoot first and ask questions later. Many wounded men spent days crawling back to their own side. Then there were the men who, for their own reasons, simply fell out of line and hid in any convenient hole. On moonlit nights, soldiers would be seen out in no man's land. Either they would be sent out into no man's land. Let me start over with that one. On moonless nights, soldiers would be sent out to no man's land to either rebuild fences, put down tanglefoot wires, or gather intel from troops in their trenches. Many of these men walked out into no man's land, never to be seen again. As more and more men went missing, stories began to circulate about what might be found out there between the lines. Night patrols would encounter one, two, and sometimes entire packs of men, some in the remnants of uniforms from both sides. These men could no longer be described as men. They had become feral creatures looking for anything to consume. They preyed on the dead or the living as needs arose. Most were armed only with trench knives that they had with them on the day or the night they became lost. Yes, they would take weapons from the dead, but most simply relied on their knives. Quieter. Men on watch would see these ghostly shapes moving about in the dark. Both sides would shoot at them, but nobody knows for sure if these beings were killed or even could be killed. At the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month, an armistice was declared. No more shooting and killing. It was time to get back to living. No man's land was no longer quite as unsafe. As soldiers began wandering about, seeing up close what had been viewed with fleeting glimpses in the past, they began to encounter beings that had called this area home. These soldiers were still a very real threat. Nobody was willing to attempt to reason with these creatures, so the unofficial word was shoot on sight. The men hiding in no man's land were wiped out. No record was made of the deed. It was all for the better of the military. The men of no man's land had very much become ghouls. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, share it around, let other people know what they're missing. If you have any stories you'd like to share with me or the podcast, you can contact me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Until next time, this is Chris James.
Are you coming to the tree where there's strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.